The cold wind whipped across the barren Kansas plains as Harriet Miller gathered the last of her meager belongings, her husband's accusations still ringing in her ears. 3 years of marriage, 3 years of disappointment, and now she stood abandoned on the doorstep of what had once been her home, banished for a failure her body couldn't control. "You're useless to me," Walter had spat, his face contorted with disgust. "A wife who can't bear children ain't no wife at all. I want you gone by sundown." Harriet's fingers trembled as she secured the small bundle of clothes and personal items to her horse. At 24, she had just become an outcast in Cottonwood Falls, a small frontier town where a woman's worth was measured by the children she produced. The whispers had started months ago, judgmental glances following her down the dusty main street. Now, as the setting sun painted the horizon in fiery hues, those whispers had solidified into her exile. The year was 1873, and the American frontier offered little mercy to a woman alone. Harriet had no family to return to. Her parents had succumbed to fever 2 winters past, and her only brother had disappeared during the war. With nowhere else to turn, she mounted her horse, an aging mare named Penny, and pointed the animal westward. "We'll find somewhere, girl," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Somewhere they don't judge a woman by what her womb can do." The journey ahead stretched vast and uncertain. Harriet had heard tales of boom towns further west, places where the rush for silver and gold created opportunities even for those society had cast aside. With $50 sewn into the hem of her dress and a small revolver tucked into her saddlebag, a gift from her father she'd never imagined needing, she left behind the only life she'd known. 3 days later, Harriet's water supplies were dangerously low, and Penny was showing signs of fatigue. The rolling prairie had given way to rockier terrain, and though she'd passed a few homesteads, she'd kept her distance, unsure of her welcome. As dusk approached on the 3rd day, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising a storm that could prove deadly to an exposed traveler. "Just a little further," she urged her horse, spotting what appeared to be a small cluster of buildings in the distance. Her hope flared briefly until a deafening crack of thunder spooked Penny, who reared violently. Harriet clung desperately to the reins, but exhaustion had weakened her grip. She felt herself slipping, then falling, the ground rushing up to meet her with unforgiving force. Pain exploded through her shoulder and head. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was Penny galloping away, carrying with her most of Harriet's worldly possessions. When consciousness returned, it came with the sensation of warmth and the crackling sound of a fire. Harriet's eyes fluttered open to find herself lying on a simple cot in a modest cabin. A lantern cast soft light across rough-hewn walls decorated with a few animal pelts and a rifle mounted on pegs. "You're awake," a deep voice observed from somewhere to her right. Harriet turned her head, wincing at the pain that shot through her temple. A tall man stood by a small wood stove, pouring something into a tin cup. His broad shoulders were outlined by the firelight, his face partially shadowed beneath the brim of a weather-worn hat. "Where am I?" Harriet asked, her voice a raspy whisper. "My ranch, about 15 miles outside Silver Creek." He approached, offering her the cup. "Found you half dead in the storm. Your horse showed up at my corral, spooked and riderless. Figured her owner couldn't be far." As he moved into the light, Harriet could see him clearly for the first time. He was perhaps 30, with a face weathered by sun and wind, yet handsome in a rugged way. His eyes, a striking shade of blue, assessed her with concern rather than judgment. "Bartholomew Reid," he introduced himself, helping her sit up to drink. "Most folks call me Bart." "Harriet Miller," she replied, accepting the cup with shaking hands. The liquid was warm broth, rich with the flavor of game meat. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Reid." "Bart," he corrected. "Not much use for formalities out here." He pulled a chair close to the cot. "That's a nasty knock you took to the head. What brings a woman alone into this territory during storm season?" Harriet hesitated, shame burning behind her eyes. But something in Bart's direct gaze suggested dishonesty would be both futile and unwelcome. I had to leave Cottonwood Falls." She stared into her cup. My husband cast me out because I couldn't give him children. 3 years of marriage and my womb remained empty. He decided I was worthless. She expected the familiar shadow of disappointment or the awkward silence that typically followed such a confession. Instead, Bart's expression hardened with something that looked remarkably like anger. "Some men don't deserve the title," he said quietly. "Your husband sounds like one of them." The simple validation in his words unleashed something in Harriet, and to her mortification, tears began streaming down her face. She hadn't allowed herself to cry when Walter had thrown her out, nor during the lonely nights on the trail. Now, in the presence of this stranger's unexpected kindness, her composure crumbled. "I'm sorry," she managed, wiping her cheeks with trembling fingers. "Don't be." Bart stood, giving her a moment of privacy. "Rest now. You're safe here, and we'll figure out the rest tomorrow." As he moved away to bank the fire for the night, Harriet noticed for the first time that he walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg. She wondered what story was written in that injury, but exhaustion quickly overcame her curiosity, and she drifted back into sleep with the comforting sounds of the cabin settling around her. Morning came with the scent of coffee and bacon. Harriet awoke to find herself alone in the cabin, though the table had been set with a plate of food and a note informing her that Bart was tending to the horses and would return shortly. The domestic thoughtfulness of the gesture brought a lump to her throat. She rose gingerly, testing her battered body. Her head still throbbed, but the worst of the dizziness had passed. After using the basin of water left for her to wash her face and hands, she ate the simple breakfast gratefully, noticing for the first time the details of the cabin. It was small but meticulously maintained. A bookshelf held a surprising collection of volumes, not just practical guides to ranching and medicine, but poetry and novels as well. Everything had its place, from the cooking utensils to the tools hanging near the door. This was not the home of a careless bachelor, but a man who took pride in his solitary existence. The door opened, bringing with it a gust of fresh air, and Bart, his arms laden with firewood. "Good morning," he greeted her, assessing her improved appearance with obvious relief. "You look better." "I feel better," Harriet acknowledged. "Thank you for breakfast and for rescuing me." Bart stacked the wood neatly by the stove. "Your horse is fine, just tired and hungry like you were. Your belongings are safe, though your saddlebag took on some water." Harriet nodded, suddenly aware of the awkwardness of her position. She was a stranger in this man's home, with nowhere to go and little to offer in return for his hospitality. "I should be moving on soon," she said, though the thought filled her with dread. "I don't want to impose." Bart studied her for a moment. "Where were you headed?" "I don't rightly know," she admitted. "Somewhere I could find work, start over." "Silver Creek's growing," he offered. "They've got a hotel that might need help, and the general store owner's wife just had twins. She's been looking for someone to mind the counter." Hope flickered within Harriet. "You think they'd hire me?" "I don't see why not." Bart poured himself coffee. "But you're in no condition to travel today. That head wound needs watching, and there's another storm brewing." He hesitated, then added, "I've got a small cabin about 50 yards from here, built it when I thought my brother might join me out west. Never did. It needs airing out, but it's sound. You're welcome to stay there until you're recovered enough to decide what's next." Harriet was stunned by the generosity. "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," he interrupted firmly. "I'm not in the habit of sending injured women out to fend for themselves. Besides," he added with the hint of a smile, "Penny would never forgive me." Tears threatened again, but Harriet blinked them back. "At least let me earn my keep. I can cook, clean, mend." "We'll work something out," Bart agreed, seeming to understand her need to maintain dignity. "First, you heal. Then we'll talk about the rest." True to his word, Bart helped Harriet settle into the smaller cabin that afternoon. It was indeed dusty from disuse, but sound, with a small stove, a bed, a table with 2 chairs, and a chest for storage. He brought over clean linens, kindling, and some basic provisions, promising to check on her before nightfall. Left alone, Harriet sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the sudden turn her life had taken. Just days ago she'd been cast out, deemed worthless. Now, a stranger had offered her shelter with no apparent expectation of repayment. It seemed too good to be true, and years of disappointment had taught her to be wary of hope. Yet, as she watched the afternoon light filter through the small window, casting golden patterns across the wooden floor, Harriet allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, that perhaps her journey had led her not to further hardship, but to an unexpected sanctuary. The next few days passed in a rhythm that grew increasingly comfortable. True to her word, Harriet insisted on making herself useful once her dizziness subsided. She cooked meals for them both, cleaned both cabins, and began mending Bart's work clothes, which showed signs of hasty bachelor repairs. For his part, Bart seemed both appreciative of her efforts and careful to give her space. He spent his days tending to his modest herd of cattle and horses, repairing fences damaged in the recent storms, and preparing for the coming winter. In the evenings, they would share meals, sometimes in his cabin, sometimes in hers, and conversation flowed more easily than Harriet would have expected. She learned that Bart had come west after the war, where he'd served with the Union cavalry and sustained the injury that caused his limp, a Confederate bullet that had shattered his knee at Gettysburg. He'd used his soldier's pay to purchase the land, building everything himself over the past 9 years. "Why alone?" Harriet had asked one evening as they sat by the fire. "Most ranchers I knew back in Kansas had families, hired hands." Bart had stared into the flames for a long moment. "Tried hiring help a few times. Didn't take. As for family," he shrugged, "never seemed to be in the cards." There was more to the story, Harriet sensed, but she didn't press. They each had their private sorrows, and she respected his right to keep his close. A week turned into 2, and though Harriet mentioned riding into Silver Creek to inquire about work, Bart seemed in no hurry to facilitate her departure. "Winter's coming," he'd point out whenever she raised the subject. "Roads get treacherous. Besides, I've got more than enough work here to keep us both busy until spring." Part of Harriet knew she should insist, that staying risked her reputation and perhaps his as well. Yet another part, a part that grew stronger each day, was reluctant to leave the peaceful routine they'd established. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of expectation and subsequent disappointment crushing her. With Bart, she was simply Harriet, not a failed wife or a barren woman, but a person of value. One crisp October morning, Harriet was hanging laundry on the line strung between the 2 cabins, when she noticed Bart limping more pronouncedly than usual as he crossed the yard. "Your leg's troubling you," she observed as he approached. He grimaced. "Old wounds complain when the weather changes. Nothing to fuss over." "I've made a salve," she said, gesturing toward her cabin. "My mother taught me willow bark and other herbs. It might help." Bart looked surprised but nodded. "Worth a try, I suppose." That evening, after supper, Harriet brought out the small pot of fragrant ointment. "You'll need to roll up your pant leg," she instructed, trying to sound matter-of-fact despite the intimacy of the request. Bart hesitated only briefly before complying, revealing the massive scar tissue that covered his left knee and calf. Harriet couldn't suppress a small gasp at the severity of the old wound. "Not a pretty sight," Bart acknowledged gruffly. "I'm just surprised you can walk at all," she replied honestly, kneeling beside his chair. "May I?" At his nod, she began applying the salve with gentle, practiced movements. Her fingers worked the medicine into the damaged tissue, careful not to press too hard on the areas that made him tense. "My mother was known for her healing touch," Harriet explained, focusing on her task rather than the unexpected intimacy of the moment. "She taught me which plants could ease pain, fight fever, heal wounds." "Useful skills out here," Bart commented, his voice sounding oddly strained. When she glanced up, she found him watching her with an intensity that sent heat flooding to her cheeks. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, something unspoken passed between them, something that made her breath catch and her hands still against his scarred skin. Then Bart cleared his throat and shifted slightly, breaking the moment. "Thank you," he said quietly. "It does feel better." Harriet nodded and finished her ministrations, acutely aware of a shift in the atmosphere between them. As she gathered her supplies and bid him good night, she wondered if he felt it too, this dangerous, tentative possibility that was taking root despite all reason and caution. Back in her cabin, Harriet pressed her hands to her flushed cheeks, trying to regain her composure. She was still legally married, she reminded herself sternly, even if Walter had cast her out. And Bart was her benefactor, nothing more. To imagine otherwise was to court disappointment and perhaps disaster. Yet, as she prepared for bed, Harriet couldn't help but recall the warmth in Bart's blue eyes, so different from the cold contempt that had filled Walter's in those final months. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her with genuine appreciation rather than assessment, and the memory of it followed her into dreams that left her restless and yearning. November arrived with a vengeance, bringing the first serious snowfall of the season. Harriet awoke to a world transformed, the familiar landscape outside her window now a vast expanse of pristine white. The beauty of it momentarily took her breath away until practical concerns reasserted themselves. Snow meant additional challenges keeping paths clear, ensuring the livestock had access to feed and unfrozen water, maintaining adequate firewood. She dressed quickly in the layers that Bart had insisted on providing her warm woolen garments that had belonged to his mother, he'd explained awkwardly, kept in a trunk all these years. They were a bit large on Harriet's frame, but infinitely warmer than her own thin dresses. Outside, she found Bart already at work, clearing a path between the cabins and the barn. He looked up at her appearance, snow-dusting his hat and shoulders. "Good morning," he called, his breath visible in the cold air. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Harriet nodded, pulling her shawl tighter. "It's beautiful, and a bit daunting." Bart smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "First big snow always is, but we're well prepared." He gestured toward the woodpile, stacked high under a protective overhang. "Pantry's full, smokehouse too. We'll weather it fine." The casual "we" sent a warm flutter through Harriet's chest, though she knew it was merely practical acknowledgement of their shared situation. Still, as she helped with the morning chores, she couldn't help noticing how naturally they worked together, anticipating each other's movements, sharing tasks without need for discussion. By midday, the snow was falling again, thick flakes swirling in the wind that had picked up. Bart insisted they finish the outdoor work quickly and retreat to the warmth of his larger cabin, where they could conserve firewood by maintaining just one hearth. "No sense freezing in two places," he reasoned, and Harriet couldn't argue with the practicality of it. They spent the afternoon in companionable activity, Harriet baking bread and preparing a hearty stew with preserved vegetables and smoked venison, while Bart mended harnesses and checked his supplies. As darkness fell early, bringing with it howling wind that rattled the window frames, Harriet found herself grateful for the solid walls and warm fire, and for the quiet presence of the man who shared them with her. After supper, Bart surprised her by retrieving a battered chess set from a shelf. "Do you play?" he asked, setting it on the table between them. "My father taught me," Harriet admitted, "though I haven't played in years." "Might be a good way to pass these winter evenings," Bart suggested, arranging the pieces. "Unless you'd prefer reading aloud. I've got a fair collection of books." Harriet smiled at the thoughtfulness of the offer. "Chess would be lovely, though I warn you, I may be quite rusty." Her rustiness proved deceptive, as she captured Bart's queen within the first dozen moves, prompting a surprised laugh from him. "Your father taught you well," he conceded, studying the board with new respect. "He believed girls should exercise their minds as well as learn domestic arts," Harriet explained, feeling a pang of nostalgia for those evenings spent at her father's side, learning the strategies of the game while her mother sewed nearby. They played until the fire burned low, the howling storm outside making the cabin's warmth all the more precious. When Harriet finally yawned, unable to suppress her fatigue, Bart immediately began clearing away the game. "You should take the bed," he said, nodding toward his own sturdy bed in the corner. "I'll make up a pallet by the fire," Harriet protested immediately. "I couldn't possibly displace you from your own bed." "You're not displacing me," Bart insisted. "It's practical you'll be warmer there, and I'm used to rough sleeping from my army days." The thought of returning to her own cold cabin in the blizzard wasn't appealing, but neither was taking Bart's bed while he slept on the floor. They reached an impasse, both too stubborn to yield, until Bart sighed in exasperation. "The bed's plenty large," he said finally, a flush creeping up his neck. "We could share it properly with a blanket between us if you wish, just for warmth and practicality." Harriet felt heat rise to her own cheeks at the suggestion. Propriety demanded she refuse. She was still technically a married woman, after all. Yet the storm raged outside, and the thought of either of them spending an uncomfortable night unnecessarily seemed foolish. "A blanket between us," she agreed quietly. "For warmth only." They prepared for bed with careful courtesy, each taking turns to use the wash basin and change behind the privacy screen. Harriet, in her borrowed nightgown and with her hair in a long braid, felt oddly vulnerable as she approached the bed where Bart had already arranged a thick blanket down the middle, creating a barrier between what would be her side and his. "Good night, Harriet," he said formally, extinguishing the lamp once she had settled beneath the covers. "Good night, Bart," she replied, lying rigid in the darkness, acutely aware of his presence just inches away despite the blanket between them. She thought sleep would elude her. But the day's work and the warmth of the bed soon lulled her into slumber. When she woke sometime in the night, it was to find that the blanket barrier had been disrupted, and in sleep she had turned toward Bart, her hand resting against his shoulder. For a moment she held perfectly still, listening to his steady breathing. He slept peacefully, apparently undisturbed by her unconscious breach of their boundary. In the dim light cast by the banked fire, Harriet studied his face, relaxed in sleep and somehow younger, the lines of worry and responsibility temporarily erased. Something tender and dangerous unfurled in her chest, a feeling she had thought herself incapable of after the harsh ending of her marriage. Carefully, she withdrew her hand and restored the blanket barrier, turning away to face the wall. Yet sleep proved elusive after that, her mind filled with troubling questions about a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. Morning brought an end to the storm, but not to the snow, which lay deep across the landscape. Harriet and Bart avoided each other's eyes over breakfast, an awkwardness between them that hadn't existed before. She volunteered to return to her cabin, suggesting that the worst of the weather had passed, but Bart frowned at the proposal. "Another storm's coming," he said, gesturing toward the western horizon where dark clouds were already gathering. "I can feel it in my knee. Best conserve firewood and stay together." Harriet wanted to argue, but found she lacked conviction. The truth was, she didn't want to return to the solitude of her cabin, not when the alternative was Bart's company, despite the complications it presented. The day passed in familiar tasks, though conversation remained somewhat stilted. By evening, Bart's prediction proved accurate as another blizzard descended, this one even fiercer than the last. The wind found every crack in the cabin's construction, creating eerie whistling sounds that set Harriet's nerves on edge. "This is a bad one," Bart commented, adding more wood to the fire. "Good thing we brought in extra supplies this morning." Harriet nodded, focusing on her mending rather than meet his gaze. The chess set remained on the shelf, neither of them suggesting a game. Instead, they worked in silence until Bart unexpectedly spoke. "I was married once." The revelation startled Harriet into looking up. Bart wasn't facing her, his attention seemingly on the fire he was tending, but the set of his shoulders revealed tension. "Her name was Rebecca. We married just before I left for the war. She wrote faithfully for the first year." He paused, poking at a log with unnecessary force. "Then the letters stopped. I thought perhaps they were just getting lost. Mail was unreliable. But when I returned home, I found she'd married a local merchant who'd paid his way out of service." Harriet's heart ached at the matter-of-fact way he recounted such betrayal. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Bart shrugged, finally turning to face her. "It was a long time ago, but it's why I came west, why I keep to myself. Figured it was easier than risking that kind of hurt again." The confession hung in the air between them, its purpose unclear until Bart continued. "I tell you this so you understand. I know what it is to be discarded by someone who promised forever. What your husband did, casting you out because you couldn't bear children, it's no reflection on your worth, Harriet. The failure is his, not yours." Tears pricked at Harriet's eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. "Thank you," she managed, setting aside her mending before her trembling hands could betray her. But it doesn't change the fact that I failed at the one thing a wife is supposed to provide. Is that all a woman is? Bart challenged, his voice gentle despite the directness of the question. A vessel for children? What about your mind, your heart, your hands that can heal and create? What about the way you make this place feel like a home for the first time since I built it? Harriet stared at him, caught between hope and caution. Bart! You don't have to say anything, he interrupted, suddenly looking uncertain. I needed you to know that to me, you're enough exactly as you are. Children or no children. The words, so simple, yet so profound, broke something loose inside Harriet, some tightly held knot of shame and inadequacy that had been wound around her heart for years. A sob escaped her, and then another, until she was weeping openly, years of pent-up grief pouring out in a torrent she couldn't control. Bart moved to her side immediately, his strong arms encircling her with hesitant tenderness, as if afraid she might shatter or pull away. But Harriet did neither, instead turning into his embrace, seeking comfort in the solid warmth of him. I'm sorry, she gasped between sobs. I don't know why. Shh, Bart murmured, one hand stroking her back soothingly. You don't need to explain. Just let it out. And she did, crying until her throat was raw and her eyes burned, purging herself of the pain and humiliation that had been her constant companions for so long. Throughout it all, Bart held her, his presence an anchor in the storm of her emotions. When the tears finally subsided, Harriet became acutely aware of their position, her face pressed against his chest, his arms around her, their bodies closer than propriety would allow. Yet she couldn't bring herself to pull away. Not when this closeness felt like the first real comfort she'd known in years. I should be mortified, she admitted, her voice muffled against his shirt. Falling apart like that. Bart's chest rumbled with a soft laugh. If anyone's earned the right to fall apart, it's you. Besides, tears don't frighten me. Not yours anyway. Harriet finally looked up, meeting his gaze. What she saw there concern, yes, but also something warmer, something that made her breath catch, gave her courage. What happens now? She asked quietly. Bart's hand came up to brush a strand of hair from her damp cheek, the touch impossibly gentle. Whatever you want to happen, there's no rush to decide anything. But in that moment, looking into his eyes as the storm raged outside and warmth surrounded them within, Harriet knew with sudden clarity exactly what she wanted. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. I want to stay, she whispered, not just until spring, not just as your housekeeper or neighbor. Understanding dawned in Bart's expression, followed by a cautious hope. You're still married in the eyes of the law, he reminded her, though the words seemed to cost him. A marriage that exists only on paper, Harriet countered. Walter cast me out, publicly disowned me. In time I could seek a divorce. The word felt scandalous on her tongue, but also right. Until then, we could still build something here, together. Bart studied her face intently, as if searching for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, he nodded slowly. Together, he echoed, the word a promise. We'll figure out the rest as we go. His hand cupped her cheek, and with infinite care, he leaned forward to press his lips to hers, a kiss so tender it brought fresh tears to her eyes, these born not of sorrow, but of a joy she had thought forever beyond her reach. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault, but within the cabin's walls, Harriet had found an unexpected shelter, not just from the elements, but from the cruelty of a world that had deemed her worthless. In Bart's arms, in his eyes that saw her true value, she discovered the possibility of a new beginning, one built not on society's narrow definitions, but on the foundation of being truly seen and accepted for exactly who she was. As winter tightened its grip on the land, Harriet and Bart settled into a new rhythm. Though they maintained separate sleeping arrangements most nights, concession to propriety and the legal complications of Harriet's marital status, their days were spent in growing closeness. They shared meals, work, and increasingly, their hopes and memories. Harriet learned that Bart had been the youngest of 4 brothers, the only one to survive both childhood illnesses and the war. He spoke of his parents with quiet reverence, his father, a blacksmith who had taught him to work with his hands, his mother, a school teacher who had instilled in him a love of books. Both had passed before he headed west, leaving him truly alone in the world until Harriet's arrival. In turn, she told him of her own family, her physician father who had encouraged her interest in herbal medicine, her practical mother who had nonetheless filled their home with music and beauty, her older brother Henry who had ridden off to war at 18 and never returned, his fate a mystery that still haunted her. "Perhaps that's why I understood your grief so well," Bart mused one evening as they sat before the fire. "The not knowing can be worse than certainty sometimes." Harriet nodded, her hands busy with the quilt she was piecing together from scraps of fabric she'd found in a trunk. "For years I imagined him coming home, walking up our lane as if he'd just been away on a long journey. Mother kept his room ready until the day she died." "And you?" Bart asked gently. "Do you still look for him?" Harriet considered the question. "I think I've accepted that he's gone," she said finally. "But I still wonder about his last moments, whether he was afraid, whether anyone was with him, whether he knew how much he was loved." Bart reached across the space between their chairs to take her hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. "He knew," he assured her. "The love of a family like yours isn't something a person forgets, even in their darkest moments." The tender certainty in his voice warmed her more than the fire. It was these moments' quiet exchanges where they revealed their true selves to each other without judgment that Harriet treasured most. With each passing day, the bond between them strengthened, building toward something she was increasingly willing to acknowledge as love, despite the complications it presented. December brought Christmas, a holiday Harriet had approached with mixed emotions in recent years. The last Christmas with Walter had been strained, his disappointment in her apparent in every terse exchange. Before that, the first Christmas after her parents' deaths had been a hollow affair, grief overshadowing any attempt at celebration. But Bart, she discovered, took quiet joy in the season. On Christmas Eve, he surprised her by bringing in a small pine tree, setting it up in a corner of the main cabin. "I thought we might decorate it," he suggested, almost shyly. "I've some trinkets my mother saved and pine cones we could gather." "If you'd like." The thoughtfulness of the gesture, his effort to create normalcy and celebration despite their isolation, touched Harriet deeply. "I'd like that very much," she said, her voice thick with emotion. They spent the afternoon transforming the simple tree with the treasures from Bart's mother's chest, delicate glass ornaments wrapped carefully in cloth, strands of dried berries, small wooden figures carved by his father. Harriet contributed paper stars she fashioned from pages of an old catalog, painting them with pigments she'd created from herbs and roots. When they'd finished, Bart lit candles and placed them carefully among the branches, their soft light reflecting off the ornaments in a dance of golden warmth. "It's beautiful," Harriet breathed, standing back to admire their handiwork. "My mother always said a Christmas tree should tell a story," Bart remarked, coming to stand beside her. "Each ornament a memory, a piece of who we are and where we've been." Harriet looked at the tree with new understanding, seeing not just decoration, but narrative, the mingling of Bart's past with the present they were creating together. "What story does this one tell?" she asked softly. Bart's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her against his side. "New beginnings," he said simply. "Hope finding its way through the darkest season." She leaned into him, allowing herself the comfort of his embrace. "I like that story." Later, after a special supper Harriet had prepared using precious stored ingredients, Bart presented her with a small, carefully wrapped package. "Merry Christmas," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. Inside, Harriet found a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. When she opened it, she discovered a tiny pressed wildflower, the first bloom of spring, preserved perfectly. "It was my mother's," Bart explained. "She always said it reminded her that even after the hardest winter, beauty returns to the world." Tears pricked at Harriet's eyes as she traced the fine engraving on the locket's surface. "It's perfect," she whispered, overcome by the significance of the gift, not just the item itself, but the family history it carried. "Will you help me put it on?" Bart's fingers were surprisingly deft as he fastened the clasp at the nape of her neck, his touch lingering in a caress that sent warmth cascading through her. When she turned to face him, the tenderness in his expression nearly undid her. "I have something for you as well," she said, retrieving a package from her own cabin earlier in the day. Though it seems humble in comparison. Bart unwrapped the gift with careful hands, a scarf she had knitted from wool she'd unraveled from an old blanket and re-dyed, along with a small leather pouch containing the salve she'd created for his knee pain, improved with additional herbs she'd gathered before the snows. "There's nothing humble about something made with such care," he said, wrapping the scarf around his neck immediately. "Thank you, Harriet." The genuine appreciation in his voice made her smile. "You've given me so much," she said. "A home, safety, purpose. This is a small token in return." "You've given me far more," Bart countered, taking her hands in his. "This place was just a shelter before you came. You've made it a home." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to fully articulate. Instead, Bart raised her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that conveyed what remained unspoken. That night, as snow fell gently outside and the candles on their Christmas tree burned low, they sat side by side before the fire, shoulders touching, sharing stories of Christmases past and tentative hopes for the future. It was a moment of perfect peace in Harriet's once tumultuous life, a gift more precious than any material offering. January brought the harshest cold Harriet had ever experienced, temperatures so bitter that breath froze instantly and the snow squeaked underfoot like crushed glass. Despite the challenges of the weather, a surprising contentment settled over the ranch. Their days followed a pattern tending to the livestock, maintaining the cabins, preparing meals, and in the evenings, chess games or reading aloud from Bart's collection of books. Yet beneath this tranquil surface, Harriet was increasingly aware of a growing tension, not unpleasant, but insistent. The careful boundaries they had established began to blur. Touches lingered, glances held deeper meaning, and the air between them sometimes seemed charged with unspoken desire. One particularly brutal night, with wind howling like a living creature around the cabin's walls, they sat close on the small sofa Bart had crafted years earlier, a single blanket wrapped around both their shoulders as he read aloud from Wuthering Heights. The story's wild passion seemed to echo the storm outside, and perhaps it was this resonance that prompted Harriet to voice the question that had lingered in her mind for weeks. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked during a pause in the reading. "Taking me in, becoming entangled in my complicated situation?" Bart marked their place in the book with his finger, giving the question the consideration it deserved. "Not for a moment," he said finally, his voice low but certain. "Meeting you may have been chance, but keeping you close has been the most deliberate choice of my life." The simple honesty of his answer made Harriet's heart swell. "Even knowing I'm still legally bound to another man? That any future between us would begin with complication?" "Some things are worth the complications," Bart replied, setting the book aside to take her hand. "Harriet, I need you to understand something. I'm a patient man. I can wait for divorce papers, for legal clarity, for whatever time you need to be certain of your own heart. What I can't do is pretend that what I feel for you is anything less than love." The declaration, so plainly spoken, stole Harriet's breath. Despite the growing closeness between them, despite the tender moments and meaningful glances, neither had yet given name to the emotion that had been building. "Love," she repeated, the word both familiar and suddenly new, as if she were learning its true meaning for the first time. "Love," Bart confirmed, his eyes never leaving hers. "I love your strength, your kindness, your hands that can mend and heal, your mind that challenges mine, your heart that has endured so much yet remains open. I love who I am when I'm with you better, more complete." Tears filled Harriet's eyes, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming emotion. "I thought that part of me was dead," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the storm. After Walter, after being told repeatedly that I was lacking, deficient, I believed I was incapable of being loved or of loving in return. Bart's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch reverent. And now? Now I know differently, Harriet whispered, leaning into his touch. Because I love you too, Bartholomew Reid, with a fullness I never imagined possible. The admission seemed to transform the very air around them, the storm outside fading to insignificance compared to the tempest of emotion within. Bart's expression shifted from tender affection to something deeper, more primal, and when he leaned forward to capture her lips with his, Harriet met him halfway. Unlike their previous careful, chaste kisses, this one held nothing back. It was a claiming, a promise, an expression of all they had left unspoken for months. Harriet's arms wound around his neck as she yielded to the sensations cascading through her, the warmth of his mouth, the strength of his arms as they pulled her closer, the rightness of their bodies fitting together. When they finally parted, both breathless, Bart rested his forehead against hers. "I should stop," he murmured, though his hands still cradled her waist. "You're still married only on paper," Harriet finished for him. "In my heart, in every way that matters. I've been yours since that first night you told me I was enough just as I am." The words seemed to break the last of Bart's restraint. With a groan that was part surrender, part triumph, he gathered her into his arms, lifting her as if she weighed nothing despite his injured leg. "Tell me to stop, and I will," he promised, carrying her toward his bed. But stopping was the furthest thing from Harriet's mind, as she wound her arms around his neck, pressing kisses to his jaw, his throat. "Don't stop," she whispered against his skin. "Love me, Bart. Make me yours in truth." That night, as the blizzard raged beyond the cabin walls, Harriet discovered what it meant to be truly cherished. In Bart's tender, passionate lovemaking, she found not the dutiful, often painful encounters that had characterized her marriage to Walter, but a communion of bodies and souls that left her breathless with wonder. Afterward, lying in the circle of his arms with her head pillowed on his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart, Harriet felt a sense of homecoming so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "What is it?" Bart asked, feeling the dampness against his skin. "Did I hurt you?" "No," she assured him, raising her head to meet his concerned gaze. "These are happy tears. I never knew it could be like this, so beautiful, so right." Relief and tenderness softened his expression. "This is how it should always have been for you," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "This is how it will be from now on, if you'll have me." "I'll have you," Harriet promised, settling back against him, "for as long as you'll have me in return." As they drifted toward sleep, entwined beneath the warm blankets while winter howled impotently outside, Harriet marveled at the strange, winding path that had led her here from rejection and despair to this sanctuary of love and acceptance. The journey wasn't over. There would be legal hurdles to overcome, perhaps social censure to face, but with Bart beside her, she felt equal to whatever challenges lay ahead. February brought a brief thaw, enough that the road to Silver Creek became passable for the first time in weeks. Bart seized the opportunity to make the journey into town for supplies and mail that had accumulated over the winter months. Harriet remained behind, tending to the animals and preparing for his return by baking bread and airing out linens that had been stored away. When he returned late in the afternoon, his expression was grave in a way that immediately set Harriet's nerves on edge. "What is it?" she asked as he unburdened himself of packages. "Bad news?" Bart nodded, pulling an envelope from his coat pocket. "A letter came for you, forwarded from Cottonwood Falls. It's from a lawyer there." Harriet's heart stuttered as she accepted the envelope, breaking the seal with trembling fingers. As she read the formal language, her eyes widened in disbelief. "Walter is dead," she said finally, looking up at Bart. "Pneumonia in December. His brother contacted the lawyer to inform me, as I'm still legally his widow, and there are matters of inheritance to settle." Bart's expression remained carefully neutral. "I'm sorry for your loss," he offered, though the words sounded hollow, given all they knew of Walter's treatment of her. "I'm not sure what I feel," Harriet admitted, still processing the news. "Relief, primarily. Perhaps a touch of guilt for feeling relieved. But not grief, not really." She set the letter aside. "The lawyer suggests I return to Cottonwood Falls to settle the estate. Apparently Walter had no will, so as his widow, I inherit his property and belongings." "Will you go?" Bart asked. The question casual on the surface, but weighted with deeper implications. Harriet looked around the cabin that had become more home to her than the house she had shared with Walter ever had been. "I should," she said slowly. "Not to stay, but to settle matters properly. To close that chapter completely before beginning a new one." Relief visibly washed over Bart's features. "When the weather permits, then," he agreed. "I'll go with you if you'd like." The offer warmed her. "I would like that very much," she said, crossing to him and wrapping her arms around his waist, "but not as my protector or escort, as my future husband. If you'll still have me." Bart's arms tightened around her. "Is that a proposal, Harriet Miller?" he asked, a smile breaking through his serious demeanor. "I believe it is," she confirmed, looking up at him with certainty. "I'm a widow now, free to choose my own path, and I choose you, Bartholomew Reid, if you'll have me." "If I'll have you," he repeated, shaking his head in wonder, as if there were any question. He cupped her face in his hands, his expression solemn despite the joy radiating from him. "Yes, Harriet. I will marry you, build a life with you, grow old with you. Whether or not we ever have children, you are enough, more than enough. You're everything." The words, so similar to those he had spoken on that first night when he found her battered and broken on the prairie, yet now invested with deeper meaning, brought tears to Harriet's eyes. "And you are everything to me," she whispered, rising on tiptoe to seal their agreement with a kiss. Spring arrived early that year, as if nature itself were eager to herald their new beginning. By late March, the snow had largely melted, revealing tender green shoots pushing through the softened earth. The cattle, thin but healthy after the long winter, were turned out to graze on the fresh growth, and the days lengthened perceptibly, filled with light and warmth. As soon as the roads were fully passable, Bart and Harriet made the journey to Cottonwood Falls. It was a strange homecoming for Harriet, returning to the town where she had known both happiness and profound sorrow. Some faces turned away when they saw her, old judgments still in place, but others offered cautious smiles, perhaps seeing the change in her, the confidence and contentment that radiated from within. Walter's house stood empty, dusty but otherwise unchanged from the day Harriet had been cast out. Walking through the rooms that had once been her home felt like visiting a stranger's dwelling, so completely had she moved beyond that chapter of her life. The legal matters were settled with surprising ease. As Walter's widow, Harriet inherited not only the house but his modest savings and business interests. She chose to sell most of it, keeping only a few personal items that held sentimental value. Her mother's china, books that had belonged to her father, a quilt her grandmother had made. "Are you certain?" Bart asked as they prepared to leave town, the proceeds of the sales secure in a bank draft. "This could have been a fresh start right here." Harriet shook her head decisively. "This place holds too many ghosts," she said, looking around the town square where she had once been judged and found wanting. "My home is with you now, on land that's ours together. That's where I want our fresh start." They were married 2 days later in Silver Creek, a simple ceremony witnessed by the local minister and his wife, the general store owner and his family, and a few of Bart's trading partners who had become friendly acquaintances over the years. Harriet wore a new dress of soft blue calico, and Bart had a haircut and new shirt for the occasion. The words they spoke were traditional, but the meaning behind them transcended convention. Two people who had known profound loss, finding in each other not just companionship or practical partnership, but deep, abiding love. That evening, returning to the ranch that was now truly their shared home, Bart surprised Harriet by lifting her into his arms as they reached the cabin door. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," he explained with a grin, managing the maneuver despite his bad leg. "It's tradition." Harriet laughed, winding her arms around his neck. "Any other traditions you're planning to observe, Mr. Reid?" Several, Mrs. Reid, he replied, his voice dropping to a more intimate register as he set her down inside. And I intend to be very thorough in their observation. Later, as they lay together in the bed that was now unquestionably theirs, Harriet traced lazy patterns on Bart's chest, her wedding ring catching the moonlight that streamed through the window. "Do you ever wonder about children?" she asked softly, the question one she had avoided for months. "If I truly cannot have them?" Bart propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with serious eyes. "I meant what I said from the beginning, Harriet. You are enough for me, exactly as you are. If children come, they will be a blessing. If they don't, we will still have a full, rich life together." Harriet smiled, reaching up to touch his face. "How did I get so fortunate, finding a man who sees beyond what society demands of a woman?" "I could ask the same about finding a woman who sees value in a broken-down ex-soldier with a game leg and a tendency towards solitude," Bart countered, turning his head to press a kiss to her palm. "Not broken," Harriet corrected gently. "Beautifully whole, with all your experiences, good and painful, making you the man I love." The next morning, they began their married life in earnest. Using the funds from Walter's estate, they expanded the ranch, purchasing additional cattle and making improvements to the buildings. Harriet planted a large garden, incorporating not just vegetables, but the medicinal herbs her mother had taught her to use. Word of her healing skills spread, and soon people from Silver Creek and surrounding homesteads were making the journey to consult Mrs. Reid about their ailments. Bart built an addition to the cabin to accommodate her growing practice, a sunny room with shelves for her dried herbs and preparations, a comfortable chair for consultations, and a small bed for patients who needed monitoring. He took pride in her work, often telling newcomers, "My wife has a gift for healing that goes beyond any doctor's learning." As spring turned to summer and then autumn, their life together settled into a rhythm of shared work and quiet joy. They were not wealthy by any conventional standard, but they wanted for nothing that truly mattered. Each evening, they would sit together on the porch Bart had built, watching the sun set over the land that was flourishing under their joint care. "Are you happy?" Bart asked one such evening, his arm around Harriet's shoulders as they rocked gently in the swing he had fashioned as a first anniversary gift. "Completely," she assured him, resting her head against his shoulder, "though I might be even happier in about 7 months' time." It took a moment for her meaning to register, but when it did, Bart went utterly still. "Harriet? Are you saying—" She nodded, looking up at him with eyes shining with happy tears. "Dr. Simmons confirmed it when he passed through last week. We're going to have a baby. Bart, after all this time, all those years of believing I couldn't." The joy that transformed his face was answer enough, but he gathered her into his arms anyway, holding her as if she were the most precious treasure in the world. "A child," he breathed against her hair. "Our child." "Are you pleased?" Harriet asked, though his reaction left little doubt. "Beyond words," Bart assured her, pulling back to look into her eyes. "But Harriet, you must know this changes nothing about how I feel. You were enough for me before this miracle, and you would have been enough if it had never happened." The simple truth of his words, the same assurance he had offered that first night when she was still a broken, cast-off woman, filled Harriet with a contentment so deep it defied description. In Bart's eyes, in his love, she had found what every human heart seeks, complete acceptance, not for what she could provide or produce, but for who she was at her core. As twilight deepened around them and the first stars appeared in the vast western sky, Harriet placed Bart's hand over her still flat abdomen, where their child grew a living testament to the love that had blossomed in the most unexpected circumstances. "Enough," she echoed, the word no longer a concession but a celebration. In being enough for each other, they had created something that exceeded all expectations, a home, a life, a future, bright with promise. And in that moment, under the boundless prairie sky, with her husband's arms around her and their child growing within, Harriet knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she truly belonged.